For decades, margarine was sold to the world as the smarter, healthier choice over butter. But when researchers actually sat down and studied what margarine does inside the human body, what they found quietly changed the way nutrition science looks at this question forever. Today, we are breaking down exactly what separates these two, from what they are made of to what they actually do once they enter your system. If you want to know the full story, make sure you subscribe, because this is only the beginning. There is something quietly sitting in millions of kitchens across the United States of America right now. It is either a stick of butter or a tub of margarine. Most people reach for one or the other without thinking twice. But behind that simple choice is a story that goes back more than 100 years. A story involving governments, food industries, and a science that kept changing its own conclusions. And at the center of it all is one question that still does not have a simple answer. Which one is actually better for you? To understand where we are today, we have to go back to where this all started. Butter has existed for thousands of years. It was made by churning the cream that rises to the top of animal milk, and for most of human history, it was considered a natural, even precious food. Communities in Europe built entire agricultural traditions around it. It was traded, taxed, and treasured. But then something changed. And that change did not happen in a laboratory. It happened in a factory. In the late 1800s, a French chemist developed a process that could turn liquid vegetable oil into a solid fat. The result was margarine. At first, it was created as a cheaper alternative to butter for lower-income populations and soldiers. Nobody was thinking about health at the time. They were thinking about cost and convenience. But as the decades passed, margarine became something much more than a budget substitute. It became a symbol of modern nutrition, and that is where the story starts to get complicated. By the mid-1900s, researchers began connecting saturated fat, the kind found naturally in butter, to rising rates of heart disease in the United States of America. The logic seemed straightforward at the time. Saturated fat raises cholesterol. High cholesterol leads to blocked arteries. Blocked arteries cause heart attacks. So the recommendation was clear: stop eating butter and switch to margarine. Margarine was made from vegetable oils, which were unsaturated, and that made it look like the obvious winner. Governments endorsed it. Doctors recommended it. Food companies marketed it aggressively. For a generation of Americans, butter became the enemy. But here is what nobody was paying close enough attention to at the time. To turn a liquid vegetable oil into something solid enough to spread on bread, manufacturers had to put it through an industrial process called partial hydrogenation. And partial hydrogenation created something that did not exist in nature in significant quantities: trans fats. Trans fats are a type of unsaturated fat that has been chemically altered. And what researchers eventually discovered about trans fats would quietly begin to unravel everything the nutrition world thought it knew about margarine. Studies that emerged in the 1990s and early 2000s started revealing that trans fats were not neutral. They appeared to raise levels of what is commonly referred to as low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, the type associated with increased cardiovascular risk, while simultaneously lowering levels of high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is generally associated with protective effects on the heart. In other words, the fat that had been promoted as the heart-healthy alternative may have been doing the opposite of what it promised. This is not a conclusion that came from one study or one researcher. It came from a growing body of evidence that accumulated over years, and it fundamentally changed how the scientific community looked at margarine. The response from regulatory bodies was slow but eventually significant. The United States Food and Drug Administration moved to require trans fat labeling on food products, and by 2018, partially hydrogenated oils, the primary source of artificial trans fats, were officially banned from the food supply in the United States of America. Many countries followed similar paths. The margarine sitting on shelves today is not the same margarine that was sold 50 years ago. Most modern versions have been reformulated to remove or significantly reduce trans fats. But that raises another question entirely. If the old margarine was a problem, what exactly is the new margarine? Modern margarine is typically made using a process called intrasterification, or by blending different types of oils to achieve the right texture without hydrogenation. The result is a product that varies widely depending on the brand and formulation. Some versions are high in polyunsaturated fats. Others contain palm oil, which is high in saturated fat. Some have added vitamins. Others have emulsifiers and preservatives. The point is this: margarine is not one single thing. It is a category of processed products, and understanding what is actually in a specific product requires reading the label carefully, something most people never do. Butter, on the other hand, has a much simpler composition. It is approximately 80% fat, and the majority of that fat is saturated. It also contains small amounts of vitamins, including vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K2. And in recent years, the conversation around saturated fat has shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible to nutrition scientists of a number of large-scale analyses. Studies that combine data from dozens of individual research projects found that the relationship between saturated fat consumption and heart disease was not as direct or as certain as previously assumed. This does not mean saturated fat is now considered harmless. It means the picture is more complicated than the original narrative suggested. What researchers are now looking at more carefully is not just the type of fat, but the overall dietary context in which that fat is consumed. A person who eats butter as part of a diet rich in vegetables, whole grains, and lean proteins may have a very different health outcome than someone who eats butter alongside highly processed foods and refined sugar. The fat itself is only one piece of a much larger puzzle, and that is something the original butter versus margarine debate never fully accounted for. There is also the question of how these fats behave when exposed to heat. Butter has a relatively low smoke point, meaning it begins to break down and release compounds when heated to high temperatures. Margarine, depending on its formulation, may have a higher smoke point, which can make it more stable for certain types of cooking. However, when any fat is repeatedly heated to very high temperatures, chemical changes occur that may affect its safety. This is an area where the research is still developing, and drawing firm conclusions would be premature. Now, let us look at something that rarely comes up in these conversations, but matters more than most people realize: the economics behind these two products and what they tell us about the global food system. Butter is a product that depends entirely on the dairy industry. The largest producers of butter in the world include the European Union, the United States of America, New Zealand, and India. Because butter requires animal milk, its price is directly tied to the cost of raising dairy cattle, which is affected by factors like feed prices, land use, water availability, and seasonal changes. This makes butter inherently more expensive to produce, and that cost is reflected in what consumers pay at the store. Margarine, by contrast, is made primarily from vegetable oils, most commonly palm oil, soybean oil, canola oil, and sunflower oil. These oils are produced at massive industrial scale, particularly in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia for palm oil, and the United States of America and Brazil for soybean oil. The raw materials are significantly cheaper, and the manufacturing process, while complex, is highly optimized for large-scale production. This is why margarine has historically been and continues to be less expensive than butter in most markets. But there is a cost that does not appear on the price tag: the global expansion of palm oil production, one of the key ingredients in many margarine products, has been associated with significant deforestation, particularly in Southeast Asia. This is not a claim about any individual product. It is a documented pattern in the global supply chain that researchers and environmental organizations have been tracking for decades. Whether that is a factor worth considering when choosing between butter and margarine is a question each person must answer for themselves. From a purely economic standpoint, if a household is managing a tight food budget, the price difference between butter and margarine can be meaningful over the course of a month. However, the reformulated margarines that have eliminated trans fats and use higher quality oil blends tend to sit at a price point much closer to butter than the old generation margarines did. The cheapest margarines on the market are not necessarily the same as the more carefully formulated ones, and that distinction matters. What the global market tells us is this: both of these products have deeply embedded economic interests behind them. The dairy industry has spent decades defending butter. The vegetable oil industry has spent decades promoting margarine. Neither side of this debate is purely driven by a concern for public health. Understanding that context does not make the science any less real, but it does add an important layer to how we interpret the information we receive about these foods. What this story ultimately reveals is that the question of butter versus margarine was never as simple as it was made to sound. A food that existed for thousands of years was replaced almost overnight by an industrial product that turned out to have its own serious problems. Then that industrial product was reformulated, and now both exist side by side in a world where nutrition science is still refining its understanding of how dietary fat affects the human body. The honest answer, the one that the research actually supports, is that neither of these foods exists in. And what matters most is the full picture of what a person eats, not any single ingredient. If this video gave you something to think about, there is much more ahead. Every week we take two foods that most people assume they already understand and look at them from the inside out, the science, the history, and the economics that nobody talks about. If that is something you want to be part of, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Because the next comparison we have lined up may be the one that surprises you the most.